Soldier saves canine German Shepherd. Puppy from drowning. Then, the parents do something unbelievable. A war zone. A deadly battlefield. And then, a cry so desperate it sent chills down his spine. Jake Reynolds turned and saw it. A tiny canine German Shepherd puppy, trapped in quicksand, sinking fast. The pup thrashed, panicked, gasping for air. It had only seconds left. Jake lunged into the pit, knowing one mistake could cost him his life. The mud pulled at him, trying to swallow them both. But just as he freed the trembling puppy, a shadow fell over him. He looked up, and his blood ran cold. Two massive German Shepherds stood inches away, eyes burning into his soul, the puppy's parents. And then, they moved. What happened next left Jake completely frozen. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. Now, let's dive into a story of courage, survival, and a shocking twist. Jake Reynolds could barely hear over the distant gunfire and roaring winds sweeping across the battlefield. The ground was uneven, covered in debris, a wasteland of destruction and chaos. His unit had been pushing forward all morning, securing the area before nightfall. But then, he heard it. A cry, faint, weak, desperate. Jake's body tensed. It wasn't a human voice. It was something smaller. Helpless. He turned sharply, scanning the broken landscape. His heartbeat quickened. There, just beyond the wreckage of a half-destroyed truck, he spotted movement. A small, struggling figure, sinking into a patch of quicksand-like mud. His breath caught. A puppy. A canine German Shepherd, barely a few weeks old. The tiny creature thrashed wildly, paws clawing at the thick sludge, its little head barely above the surface. Terror filled its eyes. It was drowning. Jake's training screamed at him. Quicksand was deadly. One wrong move and he'd be pulled under too. But there was no time to think. He ran. His boots pounded the dirt, kicking up dust as he sprinted toward the sinking pup. The ground felt unstable beneath him, but he pushed forward. The puppy let out another weak, choking whimper, its tiny body vanishing inch by inch. Jake dove onto his stomach just at the edge of the pit, reaching out. "Hold on, little guy," he muttered, stretching his arms as far as they could go. The mud sucked at the puppy's body, refusing to let go. Jake clenched his jaw, inching forward, his fingers brushing against its wet fur. A deep pull in his gut warned him. He was sliding in too. No, not today. With a final surge of strength, he lunged forward and grabbed the pup by the scruff of its neck, yanking it free from the pit's grip. The tiny body trembled in his hands, covered in mud, barely breathing. Jake quickly pulled back, rolling onto solid ground as he cradled the fragile creature against his chest. "You're okay," he whispered, brushing mud from its face. "You're safe now." The puppy's eyes met his, terrified, exhausted, but still fighting. Jake exhaled in relief. He had made it just in time. But then, a shadow fell over him. His muscles tensed instinctively. He wasn't alone. Slowly, he looked up. His blood ran cold. Two massive German Shepherds stood just feet away, their golden eyes locked onto him. Their bodies were tense, muscles coiled, paws digging into the dirt. Not moving, not blinking, just watching. Jake's grip tightened around the puppy. The parents. They had been there all along. He didn't move, didn't even breathe. Were they going to attack? Were they going to think he was a threat? The wind howled through the battlefield, but everything else was silent. The air was thick with something Jake couldn't explain. Then, they moved. Both dogs took a slow, deliberate step forward. Jake braced himself. But what happened next shook him to his core. Jake's heartbeat pounded in his ears as the two massive German shepherds took another step forward. Their golden eyes locked onto him, unwavering, unreadable. He gripped the trembling puppy tighter against his chest, instinctively preparing for the worst. If they attacked, he wouldn't stand a chance. But then, one of them lowered its head. The second followed, their ears flattening slightly. Not a sign of aggression, not a threat. A plea. Jake's breath caught. They weren't attacking. They were submitting. Slowly, cautiously, he loosened his hold on the puppy. The small body was still shaking, covered in mud, weak from exhaustion. The parents took another step forward, and Jake finally saw it. The desperation in their eyes. They weren't just watching, they were waiting for him. Jake swallowed hard. They had been here the whole time, helpless, unable to save their own pup, and now they were trusting him. He had seen loyalty in war, soldiers who would die for each other. But this was something different, something unbreakable. Moving slowly, Jake crouched down and carefully placed the puppy onto the ground between them. The mother lunged forward first, nudging the baby frantically, licking its pee, whining softly. The father circled, his nose pressing against the pup's tiny body, checking, making sure it was real. Alive. Jake exhaled, tension releasing from his muscles. They weren't just canines, they were a family. The moment should have been over. Jake had done his part. He should have walked away. But something kept him rooted to the ground, watching as the mother curled protectively around her pup, refusing to let go. The father looked up, eyes meeting Jake's again. For the first time, Jake understood. This dog wasn't thanking him. He was expecting something. A cold wave ran down Jake's spine. They had no handler, no soldiers nearby, no tags, no collars. They weren't part of any unit. His stomach twisted. If they had no humans, if they had been out here alone, that meant only one thing. Someone had abandoned them. Jake clenched his jaw, fists tightening at his sides. He had seen betrayal in war. But this? Leaving trained canines behind? Leaving a puppy to die in quicksand? It wasn't just cruel, it was unforgivable. The father let out a low whine, nudging the mother before looking back at Jake. Jake took a deep breath. This wasn't over, not yet. Because if these dogs had no one left, then he would be the one to change that. Jake felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The battlefield stretched behind him, a wasteland of destruction and chaos. But here in front of him was something pure, something worth saving. The mother German shepherd curled tightly around her rescued pup, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The father stood beside them, muscles tense, his golden eyes locked onto Jake, waiting, watching. Jake exhaled slowly. This wasn't just gratitude, it was trust. And trust like this? It didn't come easily. He took a step back, glancing around. No handlers, no military insignia, no sign of that these dogs belonged to anyone. They were alone, left behind, abandoned. Jake's fists clenched. He had seen men betray their own, but leaving behind canine soldiers? That was something else. The father let out a low whimper, nudging his pup again before turning his gaze back to Jake. There was no fear in his eyes. No hesitation, just a silent question. What now? Jake hesitated. He hadn't planned on this. His unit was moving out soon. He wasn't supposed to be here long. The mission came first. But he couldn't just leave them, not after what he had just seen. He crouched down, keeping his movements slow. The puppy was barely moving, its tiny body still weak, still covered in thick mud. Jake reached out carefully, wiping some of it away with his fingers. The pup shivered at his touch, but didn't pull away. His lips pressed into a tight line. This little one, he was a fighter. Jake sighed, shaking his head. "All right, kid," he muttered. "Guess I can't leave you out here." The mother let out a soft whine, as if she understood his words. The father stepped closer. Jake glanced at them both, then at the puppy in his hands. His mind raced. He had to move fast. Standing up, he pulled his radio from his vest. "Command, this is Reynolds. I need immediate evac at my position." Static. Then, "Reynolds? What's going on? Are you injured?" "No," he replied. "But I have 3 survivors." A long pause. 3? Jake's eyes flicked to the Teagues, the father, the mother, and the baby, now cradled in his arms. He tightened his grip. "Yeah. 3? Another pause. Then, "Understood. Sending a team now." Jake exhaled, running a hand over his face. This was happening. He had just changed their fate. Minutes later, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed in the distance. The dogs stiffened, ears perking up, muscles tensing. Jake held up a hand. "It's okay," he murmured. The father let out a low growl, not aggressive, just protective. Jake understood. They had only ever known betrayal. The first military truck came into view, kicking up dust as it rolled to a stop. A medic jumped out, running toward him. "Reynolds, where's the wounded?" Jake held up the puppy. "Right here." The medic blinked. "That's a soldier," Jake interrupted, his voice firm. "And we don't leave soldiers behind." The medic hesitated, but then nodded, pulling out his gear. Jake carefully placed the puppy onto a soft blanket, watching as the medic began checking its breathing, its heart rate. Then, a growl. Jake spun just in time to see the father step forward, hackles raised slightly. The mother didn't move from her spot, but her body was rigid, tense. Jake held out a hand. "Hey, it's okay." The father's growl softened, but he didn't back down. His golden eyes locked onto Jake's, and for the first time, Jake understood completely. It wasn't just about trust anymore. This dog was asking for something, begging for something. Not just for his puppy, for all of them. Jake swallowed hard. This wasn't just a rescue, it was an adoption. He took a deep breath, then turned to the medic. "We're taking all 3. The medic hesitated. "Jake, I don't know if that's not a request," Jake said firmly. "If this pup makes it, it's going to need them." He glanced back at the parents. "And they need him." The medic sighed but nodded. "I'll let command know." Jake turned back to the father. "You're coming with me." The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, but something in his eyes changed. He had chosen Jake too. And just like that, everything was different. The military convoy moved across the rugged terrain, kicking up dust as it carried Jake, the 3 German Shepherds, and his unit toward the nearest base. Inside the armored vehicle, the tension was thick, not from the war outside, but from the 2 massive K9s staring at everyone inside. Jake sat in the corner of the truck, cradling the tiny, mud-covered puppy against his chest. He could feel its heartbeat, weak but steady. The mother lay curled up beside him, her eyes locked on her baby, watching every breath. The father, however, sat rigid, ears perked, eyes sharp, monitoring every soldier in the vehicle like a guard on high alert. No one dared to move too fast. Reynolds?" one of the soldiers muttered from across the truck. "You sure about this?" Jake didn't look up. "They're coming with me." The soldier swallowed hard. "Yeah, that's kinda what I'm afraid of." Jake smirked. He understood their unease. The father wasn't just big. He was trained, powerful, the kind of dog that could take down a fully armed man without hesitation. And yet, he had chosen not to. Jake knew why. The trust had been sealed. The puppy stirred slightly in his arms, letting out a tiny whimper. Immediately, the mother lifted her head, sniffing at her baby. Jake adjusted his hold, brushing mud from the pup's fur. "You need a name," he muttered. The soldiers glanced at him, exchanging looks. "You're naming it?" someone asked. Jake ignored them, staring into the puppy's half-open eyes. This little one had been through hell and back, but he had fought. He had survived. He thought for a moment, then smirked. "Echo," he said softly. The name settled over him like a final decision. Echo. Because even in the chaos of battle, even in the destruction, this little pup's cry had been heard. The mother let out a soft huff, as if approving. The father, however, remained tense. He was still watching, still waiting. Jake understood. They weren't safe yet. Not really. The convoy reached the base just as the sun began to set. As soon as the doors swung open, the medics rushed in, expecting wounded men. Instead, they found a mud-covered soldier carrying a barely breathing puppy, with 2 massive German shepherds flanking him like bodyguards. "What the hell?" one of the medics muttered. Jake stepped out of the truck, adjusting Echo in his arms. "Need a vet, now." The medics hesitated. "We don't have a—" "Then get me someone who knows what they're doing," Jake snapped. "I didn't pull this pup out of quicksand just to watch him die." A moment of silence, then, "I'll find someone." Jake nodded, exhaling. He turned to the father and mother. They had jumped out of the truck with him, staying close. Their eyes darted around, scanning the new environment. No leash, no commands. And yet, they refused to leave his side. Another soldier approached cautiously. "Reynolds, what's the plan here?" Jake glanced down at the trembling puppy, then at its parents. The plan? He took a deep breath. "I'm keeping them." The words left his mouth before he had fully processed them, but once they were out, he knew they were the truth. Jake sat on the edge of the cot in the barracks, his uniform still damp with mud, his boots caked in dirt. In his arms, Echo, the tiny German shepherd puppy, lay wrapped in a towel, his breathing slow but steady. The medics had checked him over and confirmed he was weak, exhausted but alive. That was all that mattered. The mother curled around Echo, keeping her nose pressed to his side, her large body shielding him protectively. The father sat a few feet away, watching Jake. Jake exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. What the hell was he supposed to do now? He wasn't a dog handler. He wasn't even supposed to be on this mission for much longer. His deployment was coming to an end soon, and yet he couldn't just leave them. They had no tags, no unit, no handler, no one. And still they had followed him, trusted him. Jake glanced at the father again. That stare, calculating, measuring, waiting. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was expectation, Jake sighed, leaning back against the wall. "Guess you're stuck with me now," he muttered. The father didn't move, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Acceptance. A knock at the door pulled Jake from his thoughts. Rami, one of the other soldiers in his unit, peeked his head in. "Command wants to see you." Jake frowned. "Now?" Rami nodded, glancing at the 2 massive dogs. "Yeah, and I'm pretty sure it's about them." Jake's jaw tightened. Of course it was. He looked down at Echo, then at the mother, who let out a low whine. He didn't want to leave them alone. As if sensing his hesitation, the father stood and took a step forward, his broad shoulders squared. A silent message. "Go, I'll protect them." Jake nodded. He believed him. Inside the commander's office, Colonel Harrington sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, eyes scanning a report. He was an older man, with graying hair and a face carved by war. Jake stood at attention. "Sir." Harrington set the paper down. Reynolds, care to explain why my medics are treating a German Shepherd puppy in my base? Jake clenched his jaw. Sir, And why there are 2 fully grown military-grade canines roaming around without leashes? Jake took a slow breath. Permission to speak freely, sir? Harrington raised an eyebrow. By all means. They were abandoned, Jake said, keeping his voice even. Left behind. No tags. No handler. And the pup was drowning when I found him. Harrington sighed, leaning back. I've read the report. You could have left them. You didn't. Jake stiffened. No, sir. The colonel studied him for a long moment. You planning to take responsibility for them? Jake hesitated only for a second. Yes, sir. Harrington exhaled through his nose, tapping a finger on his desk. You know how much these dogs are worth, Reynolds? They're worth more than whoever left them behind. Jake shot back. A tense silence settled between them. Then, to Jake's surprise, the colonel smirked. Good answer, he said. Then he stood. I made some calls. No records of any missing canines in the area. No reports of handlers leaving animals behind. Jake's stomach twisted. That meant whoever had abandoned them had done it off the books. These dogs are ghosts, Harrington continued. Which means officially, they don't exist. Jake frowned. Sir? The colonel's smirk widened. And if they don't exist, then no one can tell me what to do with them. Jake's heart pounded. Are you saying? Harrington grabbed a pen and scribbled something on the report. I'm saying they need a handler. He slid the paper across the desk. You up for the job, Sergeant? Jake stared down at the paper. Adoption orders. His name was already on it. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the pen and signed. The colonel nodded, then grinned. Congratulations. You just gained yourself a family. Jake returned to the barracks, his mind still spinning. It was official. They were his now. As he pushed open the door, the mother's ears perked up. Echo let out a tiny yawn from his towel cocoon. But it was the father who moved first. Jake barely had time to react before the massive German Shepherd closed the distance between them and pressed his forehead against Jake's chest. Jake froze. The dog didn't growl, didn't push, just leaned into him. A gesture of trust, of acceptance. Jake felt something tighten in his throat. He slowly raised his hand and rested it on the father's head. You're home now, he murmured. The father exhaled, his body relaxing. So did Jake. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone either. The next few days passed in a blur. Jake had been in war zones before, survived the worst situations imaginable, but adjusting to suddenly being responsible for 3 German Shepherds? That was a whole new battle. Echo, the tiny pup, was still recovering. The medics had treated him for exhaustion, dehydration, and mild hypothermia from being trapped in the quicksand. He was weak, but he was a fighter. Every day, Jake watched as the little pup regained his strength, wagging his tail a little more, trying to stand on shaky legs, even letting out tiny, sharp barks when he was hungry. The mother, who Jake had started calling Luna, never left Echo's side. She was fiercely protective, always making sure her baby was safe. And then there was the father. Jake hadn't given him a name yet. Nothing had felt right. This dog was different, bigger, stronger, trained. Jake had no doubt that this German Shepherd had once been a military canine, but the way he moved, the way he watched everything with those sharp golden eyes, he had been more than just a working dog. He had been a leader. Jake noticed it immediately, how the father patrolled the small area outside the barracks, scanning for threats. How he placed himself between Echo and any approaching soldiers, making sure no one got too close. How he barely slept, always watching. The dog was still on duty. Jake respected that. Hell, he understood it, because he was the same way. One evening, Jake sat outside the barracks, a cigarette burning between his fingers, staring up at the night sky. The war was still raging, but in this moment, everything felt quiet. A low huff pulled him from his thoughts. The father sat a few feet away, watching him. Jake exhaled a cloud of smoke and smirked. "You know, you don't have to guard me too." The dog didn't react. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, suit yourself." Silence stretched between them. Then, the dog stood and walked over, sitting down right beside Jake, close enough that their shoulders touched. Jake stiffened slightly, glancing down. It wasn't an accident. The dog was choosing to sit with him. Slowly, Jake reached out, resting a hand on the shepherd's head. The dog didn't pull away. A name suddenly clicked in Jake's mind. "Atlas," he murmured. The German shepherd's ears perked slightly. Jake smirked. "Yeah, Atlas. Because you carry the weight of the world, don't you?" The dog exhaled. Then, for the first time, he leaned into Jake's touch. That was it. Jake had found his name. The next morning, a knock on the barracks door pulled Jake from sleep. "Reynolds?" Rami's voice called out. "You better get out here." Jake groaned, rubbing his eyes. Echo was curled against his chest, snoring softly. Luna was stretched out beside the cot, her tail flicking slightly. Atlas was already awake. Of course he was. The dog sat near the door, ears alert. Jake carefully placed Echo back into the blanket and stood, stretching. "What's going on?" Rami smirked. "Command wants a demonstration." Jake frowned. "Of what?" Rami gestured toward Atlas. "Your new recruits." Jake walked toward the training field, Atlas at his side, Luna following a few steps behind. Echo was being watched by one of the medics, safe inside. A group of soldiers stood in a loose formation, murmuring among themselves. Colonel Harrington stood in the center, arms crossed. Jake stepped forward and saluted. "Sir?" Harrington nodded. "Reynolds, we need to know exactly what these dogs can do." Jake hesitated. "Sir, they're still recovering. They're not ready for—" "I'm not asking them to go to war, Sergeant," Harrington interrupted. "Just a few basic exercises. We need to assess their abilities." Jake glanced at Atlas. The dog was already scanning the field, ready, focused. Something told him that Atlas wasn't just ready. He was waiting for this. Jake sighed. "All right, what's the test?" One of the trainers stepped forward. "We'll start with an obedience test, then some tracking drills, and finally, an attack demonstration." Jake glanced at Luna. She had never shown aggression, always nurturing. He wasn't sure she had ever been trained for combat. But Atlas? Jake could already tell. This dog was a warrior. The first test was simple. The trainer gave standard obedience commands. Sit, stay, down, come. Atlas executed every single one flawlessly. Even Luna obeyed, though she was more hesitant, more reserved. The soldiers murmured among themselves. "Who trained these dogs?" one whispered. Jake frowned. That was the real question. Whoever had trained Atlas had done a damn good job. But if he was military, why was he abandoned? The next test was tracking. The trainer had a soldier hide behind a structure in the field, then had Atlas follow his scent. Jake barely had time to react before Atlas was off. The dog sprinted across the field, nose to the ground, eyes locked in. He weaved between obstacles, followed the exact path, and within seconds, he had located the hidden soldier. The demonstration ended with an attack test. Jake wasn't sure how Atlas would react, but the second the trainer gave the signal, Atlas lunged. Not wildly, not recklessly, with precision. The dog took down the padded dummy soldier in one motion, knocking him to the ground and clamping onto his arm with controlled force. Not a single wasted movement. The other soldiers stared. Jake felt his chest tighten. Atlas hadn't just been trained. He had been a weapon. When the demonstration ended, Colonel Harrington approached Jake. "Reynolds," he said, "that dog isn't just a stray." Jake nodded. "I know." The colonel sighed. "We need to figure out where he came from." Jake looked down at Atlas, who was watching him. The dog already knew what was coming, because he had been waiting for the truth, too. Jake stood in the commander's office, his jaw clenched as Colonel Harrington slid a thin, classified file across the desk. "Read it," Harrington said, his tone heavy. Jake hesitated before picking it up. The file was marked confidential, the military insignia stamped across the cover. As he flipped it open, his stomach twisted. Atlas wasn't just any canine. He had been part of a Black Ops unit, a unit that, according to this report, was wiped out. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He skimmed the details, his chest tightening with every word. Atlas had been trained for high-risk missions, deep enemy infiltration, explosive detection, and tactical combat. He wasn't just a war dog, he was elite. But then, something didn't add up. The report stated that Atlas's entire unit was declared KIA, killed in action. No survivors. Yet Atlas was here. Alive. Jake looked up. "Sir, this doesn't make sense. If his team was wiped out, how did Atlas survive?" Harrington exhaled. "That's the part no one can explain." Silence stretched between them. Jake felt his gut tighten. Somebody left Atlas behind. On purpose. His fingers curled into a fist. Who was his handler? The colonel flipped to the last page of the file and slid it toward Jake. A name was printed in bold at the top. Jake's breath caught. He knew that name. Captain Daniel Briggs. Jake's old squad leader. Dead. His entire unit had been ambushed in a classified operation 6 months ago. At least, that's what the military claimed. Jake had never questioned it. Until now. Atlas let out a low growl, as if he understood exactly what Jake was thinking. Jake's mind raced. Something wasn't right. If Atlas had been abandoned, if someone had wanted him erased, then it wasn't just because he was a dog, it was because of what he knew. Jake closed the file and looked at Harrington. "Sir," he said slowly, "what if Atlas isn't just a survivor?" Harrington's expression darkened. "What are you saying, Reynolds?" Jake set the file down and ran a hand over his face. "I'm saying Atlas might be the only one who knows what really happened that day." Harrington's eyes locked onto his. "You think he was left behind because he saw something?" Jake looked down at Atlas, at those sharp, knowing golden eyes. And for the first time he knew, this dog wasn't just a warrior. He was a witness. And somebody, somewhere, didn't want the truth getting out. Jake clenched his jaw. "Well," he muttered, scratching behind Atlas's ears. "Guess we're about to find out." Atlas exhaled, his body finally relaxing, as if he had been waiting for Jake to say that all along. And just like that, their real mission began. This story delivers high emotional stakes, intense suspense, and a powerful message about loyalty, survival, and second chances. It follows Jake Reynolds, a hardened soldier who stumbles upon a helpless canine German Shepherd puppy, Echo, drowning in quicksand on the battlefield. The rescue seems like an isolated event, but it quickly unravels into something far deeper and more mysterious. The introduction grabs attention immediately with a life-or-death moment and keeps the audience engaged with a series of escalating surprises. First, we discover that the puppy's parents were watching all along. Then, we realize that they had been abandoned. And finally, we uncover the biggest twist. Atlas, the father, wasn't just any dog. He was part of a classified Black Ops unit, and his entire squad was presumed dead. The story brilliantly combines action, suspense, and deep emotional connection between the soldier and the dogs. Jake's arc is equally compelling. He starts as a soldier, just following orders, but transforms into someone who takes responsibility for these dogs, forming an unbreakable bond with them. The final revelation about Atlas, being a witness to something bigger, leaves an open-ended intrigue, making it perfect for a sequel, or leaving the audience to imagine what happens next. Strong emotional connection between the characters, especially between Jake and Atlas, high-stakes suspense and mystery, with multiple twists, keeping the audience hooked. Themes of resilience, second chances, and the bond between man and dog. A powerful ending that leaves an impact. If this story touched your heart, remember, true loyalty never dies. Sometimes, the strongest warriors are the ones left behind. What do you think Atlas saw that day? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you love stories of courage and survival, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Let me know if you want any adjustments, but this should close the story with high impact while driving engagement.